Seem to be the one slow.
Looks like the right side of the room is here coming, or somewhere. So here we are, they're coming. So I would like to call to order the resumption of the workshop agenda for the Commonwealth Transportation Board. And first up this morning will be Ms. Brown on the state of good repair. So Ms. Brown, are you here? You are here. Good to see you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board.
Morning.
I have a brief presentation for you to give you an update on the application process for primary extensions and high-volume unpaved roads. First, just a little background about these programs. They were established in 2014. They were the result of legislation that was passed that impacted the Ctp Formula Funds. Specifically, the legislation added municipality maintained primary extensions as roadways that would qualify for the Ctp Formula Funds for paving for deficient pavements. Since the urban maintained primary extensions represented 14% of the overall mileage that was eligible, those funds were set aside for urban localities to apply to address deficient pavements. I would note that those same primary extensions that qualify for this funding now also qualify for state of good repair funds for paving. That same legislation adjusted the threshold for qualifying unpaved roads to receive unpaved road funds. It changed the threshold from 200 vehicles per day to 50 vehicles per day. And that did mean that more localities were able to receive unpaved road funds, but it did have an impact for some of the localities that had the higher volume unpaved roads. So this program was created to provide additional funding for some of the localities that did have these high volume unpaved roads. And this will be the fourth year that the CTB has allocated funding to these two programs. A quick overview of the application process. The application process kicked off January 31st with a letter to all localities that telling them they could apply for the funding. Applications were due March 24th. And the funding for this year for primary extensions, again, localities do have two sources of funding. They have the Ctp Formula Funds, and they also have state of good repair. We also have some additional funds that were reconciled from completed primary extension projects that have already been paved. And so the combination of those funds, we have $18.1 million available this year for localities for primary extensions. For high volume unpaved roads, this year we will have $1.2 million allocated for this program. First, I'll talk about the high volume unpaved road program. Again, this program was established to help localities that have these higher volume unpaved roads, and those are defined as unpaved roads that carry over 500 vehicles per day. There really aren't that many in the state. But essentially 10% of the funds that are available through the CTB Unpaved Road Program are set aside for these higher volume unpaved roads. And to ensure that these funds were spread out and not going to just one project or one locality, when the program was established, there was a limit of $300,000 per locality established. Applications that are received are evaluated based on the criteria that you see here. That criteria has not changed over the last 4 years. For this year, with the 10% set aside, there was $1.77 million available. We received 4 applications with the $300,000 limit. Our total requests are $1.2 million. So we actually this year have less requests than we have funding. So we will be recommending full funding of those applications we received, and the remaining funds will be available for other unpaved roads. These are the 4 counties that submitted applications: Loudoun, Prince William, Warren, and Wythe County. It is noted that 2 of these counties actually have unpaved roads that carry over 1,000 vehicles per day. But again, each of these will receive funding. And if there's no questions on unpaved roads, I'll move to...
No questions. It's $300,000. Move on.
Primary extension. Under this program, cities and towns that maintain their own urban roadways, they apply for paving funds for primary extensions. These are roadways that carry a primary number. Each qualifying urban locality can request up to a maximum of $1 million. Project requests that are submitted by localities are evaluated based on the criteria you see here listed. Scores can range from 0 to 100, with 100 being the highest score. Pavement condition, obviously, is the number one factor in determining score. Then we also evaluate whether it's on the national highway system and the traffic volume. I would also note that prior expenditures, we do provide localities that can demonstrate that they have spent at least 25% of their urban maintenance funding on pavements. They do receive 15 extra points, so it's either 0 or 15. If they've averaged spending over 25% of their maintenance allocation on paving, they get the 15 points. The same criteria is used to evaluate funding for both primary extension, Ctp Formula, and state of good repair. For this year's submissions, we had 159 applications submitted, requests over $36.5 million. We did have requests from 49 different localities. With the two funding sources we have this year of Ctp Formula Funds and State of Good Repair, we will be recommending funding of 69 total projects representing 30 different localities. Again, there are two sources of funding. With the State of Good Repair funding, there is funding available to each district for pavements and bridges that are maintained by localities. The funding that is available is based on the overall condition ratings for that district for both VDOT maintained and locality assets. For this year, for the State of Good Repair pavement portion, for primary extensions, we have $5.6 million estimated to be available. Based on that funding, will be able to fund 19 local paving projects and then partially fund another 9 paving projects. This slide summarizes the Ctp Formula Funds. In each district that had one project that wasn't fully funded, that project will be fully funded with the Ctp Formula Funds. Again, with the 14% set aside, there's $12.5 million available this year for the Ctp Formula Funds. With that funding, basically funding all remaining projects in priority order, we will be able to provide funding for the top 50 scoring applications that were not fully funded with State of Good Repair, and essentially funding all project applications that had a score of 53.8 or higher. So again, in total, we'll be funding a total of 69 projects with the two funding sources. I would note that you do have a list of the projects that will be recommended in your packet. You have two different spreadsheets. One basically shows the projects that will be funded with State of Good Repair funding. The other shows the projects that will be funded with the Ctp Formula Fund. But if it has any highlight at all, it does mean that project will be essentially fully funded. In terms of next steps, we will post the tentative list of projects that are being recommended on our webpage. We'll notify localities that applied that those lists have been posted, and we will be presenting this to you in June for your approval. And then we'll start the entire process all over again in January. And I'd be happy to address any questions.
Okay, thank you. All right, next, we're going to talk on the revenue sharing, and I think Mr. Whitworth is going to report on what his committee has been doing.
Oh, well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and associate members of CTB. Back in February, the chairman Secretary Lane established a subcommittee that was charged with studying their revenue sharing program and reporting back any recommendations that the committee felt was worthy of your consideration. Those members of the committee I got it right. Those members of the committee involved myself, Mr. Rosen, Ms. Hines, Mr. Malbon. We were supported by Ms. Brown and her staff from the Local Assistance Division. It was interesting what we found in this process, and it's something we've been discussing on more casual occasions about the need sometimes for all of us to have better understanding of some of the very complex programs that we all make decisions on, and sometimes in a fairly quick and momentous occasions. And so we use this for us, as an opportunity to dig further into our revenue sharing program, to have a better understanding of it. And what we found was the more we dug, the more we learned, and the more we found we didn't know. So I hope I'd maybe use this opportunity to do a little education to share with you all some of the things that we have a better understanding of. Our purpose, of course, was to set our mission, and the mission for our committee was to set our priorities first, and that was to emphasize, fair and equitable distribution of funds through this program. Secondly, to make sure that it does provide a degree of predictability and certainty that localities can use in their planning, and to allow revenue sharing to be used as a financial leverage for other transportation funding programs, and to ensure the effective use of revenue sharing allocations for expeditious completion of projects that are nearing the beginning. And then finally, emphasis that allocations are made to localities for specific projects, not just for general use of localities. So it's important to understand then that projects are nearing, that are qualified for this program, or projects that are nearing and ready for the beginning. It also is important that we understand that initially this program was probably geared to the smaller projects that are in not only large, but especially in our smaller rural areas. Large projects, now with the oncoming of smart scale, it's arguably the very large projects are certainly more appropriate for smart scale than, because one, it's 3, 4, 5 years out through smart scale versus this program, which is 1 year out. Our committee met 3 times. We've spent well over 6, 7 hours in discussing this project, and we probably will have one more meeting to bring back to you a final language with regard to a resolution that you will be voting on in June.
Let me back that up. I think we won't vote on in June. I think we need to allow public comment. So I don't, whatever the recommendation is, I'm going to say we're going to have at least 60 days for people to come to 2 of these meetings and make comment. This was the most heard thing during the public hearings around the state, and I think for you guys to have a resolution without allowing some written or public comment period, I think would not. So I think you're on the right path. I just want to point out, I think whatever we come up with, the resolution ought to be posted, and we have at least 60 days for them to have public comment. Not hearings, but to write to you and get that before you vote.
Right, I probably misspoke.
Okay.
In our June meeting, we will seek concurrence.
Concurrence, okay, gotcha.
And
Before we
then with
actually
a
vote.
final, we have to have this vote, we have to have this process in place at our June meeting, because then the new process goes forward from then. So actually, at our next meeting, we will be looking at the definitive language that is being recommended that we concur with. We'll go through another workshop, and we'll have the opportunity to hear further public comment with a final vote in July. During the process, the committee received input from Ms. Brown with regard to the survey feedback that went out to all the local localities and districts. There was a lot of feedback. We've had a lot of individual letters that have come in and communications. The bottom line of the conclusion is there is great interest, as the Secretary said, there's great interest and support throughout the Commonwealth with regard to revenue sharing program. Revenue sharing program is not a new program. It is pre-JB, meaning it is before Julie Brown even got here. And so it has evolved, and it will continue to evolve. This is simply another step of that evolution as we consider changes or modifications to fit the available funding, the other programs of funding that are appropriate, and also to address any loopholes that may be in our existing program where communities are able to possibly take advantage of the program because it's available to do so. As you well know, this past year, we now, in this year rather, will only be able to fund the priority one. There are 4 priorities in revenue sharing. We're only going to be able to fund the first priority because of limited funds. And so that also was the impetus of our discussion is there something that we need to address that would allow those projects in priorities 2, 3, and 4 to come to consideration for future funding. Now, what happened is staff presented, and we saw these options over the past year of things that we might want to consider to modify our program. Our committee discussed these options and then and will be bringing to you the conclusions and recommendations that I'm going to ask Julie to set forth. And she can also then explain to you how these options, if we so adopt them, may change the dynamics of the future funding with limited funds granted, and so she's got those numbers that she's willing to share with you, and I think it's something that you'll find of interest. So we're going to tag team this today, and ask Julie if you would.
Okay, so in terms of the recommendations, the study committee will be presenting to the full board. The first talk about the recommendation.
Can we back up 1 minute? You had some numbers. What was the total ask under revenue sharing this year, and what would we fund? I would like the gross dollars.
$212 million was the request.
212.
We had $100 million limit.
So let me get this right. I just want to point this out. So we funded about half our requests, where in Smart Scale we had $9.5 billion and we funded $1 billion. So I just think we need to keep in mind the type of the level of monies we're talking about. And of course, we all know that $1 billion was implemented this year because we had 300 million rolling over from last year. So we'll have our comments, but I think we need to keep in mind that we're probably funding this program at a higher percentage than any other program we're funding. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I just want you to understand the numbers involved here, because when we get in these programs, and I was thinking about going through state good of repair, I mean, we all get tied up, but at the end of the day, this one's not, but many of them are very, very small part of our overall program. But this one has, however you go, has significant implications to our overall program in terms of level of funding. So anyway, thank you.
So the first recommendation, which is to limit the maximum that a locality can request from the current $10 million to $5 million. This recommendation recognizes that with a statewide allocation of $100 million, it's very difficult to allocate $10 million to one individual locality. This also, with the maximum $5 million per year, a locality will be able to request funding of $10 million in the 2-year cycle that will be implemented starting this year. This is the most significant change in terms of the allocation that would have an impact on future allocations. We did evaluate what would have been the impact this year if this rule had been in place. And so using this year's applications as a test, this change would have reduced Tier 1 requests by $25.8 million, and it would have reduced total requests by $62.3 million. So it definitely would have an impact. And we think that's pretty consistent with what we would see in the future, because we do tend to have the same localities that are requesting the maximum $10 million each year. This recommendation also acknowledges that the increase in the maximum that a locality could request from $1 million to $10 million that was made in 2012 occurred at a time when localities that wanted to fund larger projects did not have other revenue sources, and now there are some other options that localities can seek when they're trying to fund these larger projects. Based on the survey that was done in December with localities, of the localities that responded to the survey, when asked this question, 75% indicated that they do not typically request more than $5 million, and so this change would not have an impact on those. Certainly, I will note that there are a number of localities that do ask for more than $5 million, and they've made it very clear that it would have an impact on their future transportation funding moving forward.
They would be the larger cities.
Larger, more
larger
urban.
City or
Yes.
in the Commonwealth.
Yes. The second recommendation is to establish a lifetime allocation maximum of $10 million. And that does include transfers to the project. This particular request is also aimed at, A, reducing that future demand on the revenue sharing program of these existing projects. It does align with some of the initial program goals of supporting more immediately needed smaller projects. Also, based on the locality survey results, 71% of the localities, when asked this question, indicated that a limit of $10 million on a project over the lifetime would not impact their future use of the revenue sharing program, meaning they did not anticipate that they would be seeking funding for projects over $10 million. Based on this year's applications, there were 5 applications from localities that would have been impacted had this limit been in place. It would have reduced the funding that was made to those localities by about $16 million. And with that, any questions on the allocation recommendations before I move to the transfers?
So I just want to make sure what you said, that would be a significant amount on usage. In other words, the 212 million would have gone down significantly based on going to 5 million.
Yes, that would be the most
so
significant change.
I'm trying to point out here that some of these terms will have significant impacts on the amount used. In other words, so I'm just, again, with the board, you may look at what are these impacts going to be before you make decisions, or maybe on what the level of funding ought to be, because they will have significant impacts on the amount of funds either needed or requested based on what you just said, and that which is consistent with what I would expect, because you're limiting the amount. I mean, there's some localities around the Commonwealth that put their whole construction in the CIP and the revenue sharing program and transfer around. So I think there are uses that this board never intended of them being. So in that.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Did the committee consider any sort of percentage of total project costs that you can do revenue sharing? I mean, there's a lot of commingling of these funds with other projects, and there's, once they're in the revenue sharing project, I mean, we know they're tier one, so we count them for smart scale as part of the match, or how do all those things work together? And $10 million on a $20 million project is one thing. $10 million on a $100 million project is a different situation.
And again, when funds are allocated, we've had some discussion about how the two programs, match. And after this year, they're going to be on alternating cycles. So localities should know when they're applying for the other source whether they already have the other funding in hand. We really didn't talk about a percentage. Most localities, when they apply for funding, they're expected to show that the project's fully funded. So regardless of what their source of funding is, when they put an application for revenue sharing, we expect them to show the project's fully funded. And most of the time, it's going to be fully funded with revenue sharing. And it may be that they're applying for revenue sharing and they're using smart scale for the construction, but we expect them to be able to show that. And for the most part, when they apply for the funding, they're having to show either local funds to fully fund it or that they already have the funding in place.
And that's why most of them tend to be 50%, because they're maximizing. We require them to be. But this next section we haven't got to on transfers is how that system has been gamed.
That's where I'm ultimately headed there. But because what we see a lot of times is on the revenue sharing, they say they're going to match it, but they don't have to put up the money for a certain period of time. So they get other sources of money to match that for the local match. Isn't that true?
They essentially, if we're administering it, we require them to provide the money to us up front. If they're administering it, for every dollar they spent, they get reimbursed 50 cents. So, their 50% is already there. Every bill they submit, they're only getting a reimbursement of half the cost.
Mr. Rosen?
In the presentation.
That's good. Okay, that's what I'm.
Maybe we should move on, because these are interrelated. That's why I was trying, the only point I brought this up is that a change in policy will change funding and other things. And so that's all I would be pointing out is when you make changes, you might consider incremental changes to see what that impact is going to be. Because I don't know that we could evaluate a change in, let's say, the amount of funding, and you may differ, until we see how these other changes are. Because there are all these transfers and all going on where I saw it when I was a CTB member, one part was staked to use another part, and it was a rolling type of thing where they were getting much more than what the program was intended to say. It was funding much more than that. So, not saying it's good or bad. I am saying, though, that any changes you make are interrelated with the level of funding, and that, or how you're going to see changes in how people use it, and that's all I would suggest to keep in mind.
And I was going to mention this when we go over the actual draft policy, but one of the things that the study committee recommended, and it is in the draft discussion draft for the policy, is that any changes that are made would be reevaluated by this board after 2 cycles, basically to ask the question, did we get the desired result that we were hoping for when we made these changes? And, if
I
not.
can make the point that this is a policy of the board. You can change it anytime you want. I mean, that's something you can do anytime. So, in terms of adopting something, you're going to do this or that, just remember, you can change this policy. It's not a statute. This is totally within your control. So, I don't see that as real important. I think it's important that we monitor it, but having something in there that says you're going to do it, you can do it anytime in that regard. So,
Moving to the transfer recommendations, an area that we've had a number of comments and discussions on. And so there are a number of recommendations that study committee is making moving forward on transfers. I'll kind of go through each of these. The first bullet indicates that for surplus funds on a completed project can continue to be transferred administratively to an existing revenue sharing project. So if the locality has successfully completed that project, there's a little money left, but they've got another existing revenue sharing project, they can make that transfer, make that request. But one additional restriction is that the district CTB member concurrence will be required for that transfer. Study committee.
Mr. Phelan?
I'm sorry, the question, this is what's always been my sticking to my craw. That this money is not the locality's money when we allocate it to a project. It's the state money on a project the locality is constructing. I don't understand why that money wouldn't go back in the state pot. And I need to understand that a little bit better. Now, I do like the fact that we're adding a district member concurrence, because effectively what that means is the way we actually work is if the district member doesn't want to do it, 9 times out of 10, we won't do it anyway. So this is helpful, but to me, philosophically, it's not the right policy.
And this is just one component. For most transfers, the study committee has recommended that the transfers would follow the deallocation policy, which is those transfers will only be allowed if it's to a project that needs the funding to meet an advertisement or award date that is within 1 year, 12 months of the request. The one exception to that is this first bullet, and that is that if it's surplus funds from a completed project and the locality has another existing revenue sharing project, recognizing that that existing revenue sharing project would receive first priority if they had a funding gap and a funding need, that project would receive first priority in the next application cycle.
Well, let me respond directly to Mr. Phelan. It came from, because this was remember the old formula were sort of entitlement funds. So a lot of things were seen as entitlement. This was not, but that's the way it was viewed. You might consider, instead of it being that it has to come back unless the CTB member recommends and justifies that it be transferred. In other words, the default is not they can transfer it. The default is it comes back unless the CTB member goes out and reviews it and say, I recommend for the following reasons. That might be another way to cut it, where we're not hard and fast. But the default is not to get to transfer it. The default is it comes back unless the CTB district member comes before this board and justifies it.
And maybe I should go to the next slide, and then
Yeah,
I'll come back to
might
this
be.
one. Most of the transfers, this is the recommendation of the study committee. Most transfers will need to follow the deallocation transfer policy, which is the transfer can only occur if the funds are needed to meet an advertisement or award date within 1 year of the request. Historically, most of the transfers for the revenue sharing program have probably served a very useful purpose for projects that were either scheduled for advertisement and had a shortfall, or projects that had already been advertised and bids came in higher than anticipated and there was a shortfall of funds. And so the revenue sharing process of transfers has allowed that project to move forward when it may have been delayed because there wasn't the funding that was needed to advertise or award the project. And so for those projects that need those funds in order to meet an advertisement or award date, the intent is still to allow that flexibility, but If it's to an existing revenue sharing project, it would still require the district CTB member concurrence. If it were a project that was not already a revenue sharing project, it would require full CTB approval, but again, had to meet that requirement that it's going to be advertised or awarded within 1 year.
But I don't have trouble. I'm not following the intricacies of it, and I know I wasn't on the committee, and so I'm a little reluctant to complain too much, but not that reluctant. I don't understand why when we allocate money to a project, our job is to allocate money to projects, not to delegate that responsibility to somebody else. And so that state money goes into a project, and we set it aside for a project. And for whatever reason, there's money left over, or the project doesn't go forward, or something happens, to not have that money come back to us to reallocate doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why we would allow a locality to move that money around under any circumstances.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Valentine, and Ms. I'll
You
come
know,
back, Ms.
my
Hines.
initial reaction, again, I'm not on the committee either, because
It's
I had
okay,
the.
weigh in.
So I'm not that reluctant.
Ms. Hines was, so we're going to let,
I know. I don't want to,
I know.
but I had the exact same reaction when I read the recommendation
Right.
as you. The one thing I thought about was the fact that the money could stay within the district on an already approved revenue sharing project could be an incentive for districts, for projects to be managed most efficiently. If you can save $1 million on a project, then you have an incentive to try to do it for the least amount of money. And because the money still stays in the district. So part of me was thinking, maybe it is an incentive for them, rather than saying, gosh, I'm going to spend every penny of this and not give it back. It is a little bit of a way to encourage the most efficient use of our money. That was the only thing I thought as a possible.
That only
let
works.
me
And
go to Ms.
one of the
Let me go to
things
Ms. Hines. Let me go to Ms. Hines, Brown, yeah.
Because we did struggle with this, and Julie, you correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my memory is one of the reasons we left this one as it is that in the statute itself, it says that first dibs on the money is projects which have previously been funded. And so if a jurisdiction has a little bit of savings, they're going to come into the next round anyway, and they're going to get the money. So why not allow that transfer to another project in their jurisdiction that has already been funded? Recognizing that the first set of recommendations, which limit, the total amount per project, doesn't then transfers don't allow you to go above that total amount per project. It's just, so potentially it lets the second project flow a little more smoothly because the money comes a little bit sooner. So that was our thinking. I understand what you are saying, but part of the premise of all of this was we weren't going back to the General Assembly to ask them to change the order of the way things get funded in this program, because that's in statute.
I understand that, and I think, and my recommendation would be that we do work with the General Assembly to fix some of that. I think the program needs looking at, but that's, again, beyond our purview. But what you all say about, well, they're going to get the money anyway, is only true if all Tier 1 projects are fully funded. Because if there are Tier 1 projects that we
Outside
can't
of
fully
that
fund,
district, yeah.
then they're going straight to the front of the line on their project without that money coming back to be reallocated on an application that we see fit. I just, and in terms of the incentive, I get the incentive. I think, that sort of the business part of me, that makes sense, but that doesn't make any sense on a VDOT administered project. It would only make sense on a locally administered project.
And I just want to point out one thing that's unique about the revenue sharing program. Every allocation of revenue sharing funds is matched 50-50 with the locality funds. So when we talk about transfers, let's say it's a VDOT administered project, there's money left over. So that amount of money that's left on that project is 50% VDOT's, 50% the locality. So when the locality makes that transfer to another project, it's basically their money being transferred to a project of their choice. If they don't make a transfer and we're going to deallocate it, then, their money just simply gets refunded to them, and then we have the 50% to go back for a future
Now,
distribution.
is that by practice or is that by statute?
It's by statute that every dollar that we allocate.
50-50 split going back?
I mean,
50-50
it's
statute?
their money.
No, hold on. I'm asking you, is it statute, if a project comes under, because I don't think it is, if a project comes under budget, it's not necessarily by statute that who gets the savings. That's what my point is. Because we have done things
Yeah,
not in compliance with that. So I don't think it's by statute.
because the statute requires that we match every single dollar. That would mean that if you have a $100 project, comes in at $80, $50 was theirs, $50 was
Ms.
theirs.
Brown, I'm talking
and we
about
split.
state money. I'm not talking about their city money. I'm talking about if a project's 10 million and it's 5.5, and it comes in $1 million under, I tell you, our practice has been, they got all the savings. That's the practice. So I don't believe it's, that's the practice, I can tell you.
And this program, every single expenditure is split 50/50 up to that 50.
We're not talking about expenditures. We're talking about monies that come under. And I can tell you, the practice of VDOT has been that 100% stays at the city level, because I've been in the news and going over that, practice and stuff. So I want to make sure, you're right, if it ever comes, all right, it's 50/50, but if there's savings, typically that savings has been allowed to be transferred to another project or used within that district.
And I think typically that scenario is when they are putting in extra local funds over and above
Ms.
the
Brown,
50
that
match.
is not an accurate statement. I know, because I've done it since I've been here, and Rick, you can come up, that has been the practice, that they get to keep those monies.
Mr. Secretary, members of the board, the law requires the 50/50 match.
That's right.
And the scenario you're talking about, if they have a $10 million project, that's the estimate. They ask for 5, the board provides 5, they put in 5, project is completed at $9 million. That other $1 million being transferred, that is board policy. That's not the law.
That's what I
board
thought.
policy.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And then the board can change its policy, Mr. Fraser.
I understand, but it's not the law, and that's what I want to put out. Our practice has been, we've transferred it. So that's what I want you to be careful. Don't tell me it's the law when it's not. It's our practice, and that's where I think we get into. And I don't mean that to be critical, but that's where I come back. That's the board's decision, and our practice has been to put that back. So I don't want to, if we're looking at this policy, I just want to make sure we're getting the accurate information. But I think that's right. It is a board policy that we allow them to stay there.
The law requires the match.
Right.
The law dictates the tiers.
That's
The
right.
law dictates the time in which the money must be expended or it's subject to deallocation. Those are the 3 primary
right.
focuses of the code. And the board policy goes into how we're going to administer in accordance with that legislation.
Yes. So thank you, because I know, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but that's been our practice.
Oh, and Mr. Chairman, I'd like to point out that was, and that would make sense in a world where you don't have smart scale and you don't have any money.
I understand.
But that's not our world we're living in now. And that's why this is timely to relook at this. And
Let me say a couple of things. One, with regard to Ms. Valentine, it's not district money, so we can't talk in terms of keeping it in the district. This is an obligation of the locality.
Locality, that's right.
So we need to talk in terms of locality. The other thing that we seem to be missing here is the purpose of this is to allow projects to be complete and to be current. Because remember now, we're going to a biennial meeting. So if you take this money back, it's 2 years that project could be ready for advertisement, but there's a shortfall. And if the obligation is already on the locality, and the locality is already been partially funded, it will most likely be funded for the amount that's needed that is going to come from the surplus of a project from that locality that has been completed. So it expedites a project to be completed within the locality, with the locality's obligation going forward.
I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but it's still going to the head of the line. I get it. It might, efficiency-wise, it makes sense. Policy-wise, I don't think it makes sense.
Well, the issue is, in the situation of deallocation, the obligation has been somehow either met because we came in under budget, or the locality has made the decision that it can't go forward. So I think you're right in those rare instances where, or I shouldn't say rare, maybe they're not rare, where you have an advertisement, but typically this is the you're right, it is an obligation of the locality, but it's their action that has caused us, or maybe the action of VDOT, if they've come in under budget, but it's their action that has caused us or to have a amount of funds that are now want to be put elsewhere. And the question is, should it be allowed to stay in that locality, or should it come back to the original allocation process? To me, the only place it might make sense, and if you had Tier 1 projects in that locality that were unfunded, potentially, but if you didn't have any more Tier 1 projects, but you had a Tier 1 in another place, that's where you get into the fact where you're not being, potentially could not be equitable, and if you didn't deallocate the monies. Because then you are picking a project that was a Tier 2 versus a Tier 1.
Would you be, under this scenario that's proposed, would you be able to take your surplus and, as a locality, put it on a Tier 2 project? Or would it have to be a
Tier 2 project is a new project.
As
that
existing
would clear it up.
revenue
It'd be
sharing
Tier 1.
project. It's a funded revenue sharing
It would go
project.
on an existing project that is ongoing.
There's 3 tiers, right? 4
There are
tiers.
4 tiers.
So they're existing somewhere.
Funded.
It's already received
It's already
approval
received.
and an allocation of money.
This,
So
Tier
it's
2
already a
project
Tier
is
1
not a
project.
project ongoing.
Already be fully funded.
Theory, it should
Right,
be.
so it's already a fully funded project, but we're transferring money to a fully funded project, that the locality's
May
already
have come
said
in
it's fully
over-
funded.
That when it was bid, it may have come in over, so it's not getting done. It's Tier 1, it's been funded and approved. For some reason, it's come in, the bid has come in over, and the extra money from another Tier 1 project that is complete is, in a sense, backfilling that project where the construction bid came in higher than the estimate. So it would only go to a Tier 1 project, otherwise it's deallocated,
Only go to a Tier 1 project that it has
approved and funded.
Is that right, Julie?
over, and then additional, it's come in over.
Without further CTB approval, the second bullet does indicate that it could go to a non-revenue sharing project, but it would, those requests would
Wait,
have to come to
back
the
up now. What'd you
full
say?
board.
What'd you just say?
And that comes back through the process, what you're talking about.
Not an automatic.
That
let
if
me
it's a transfer to a non-revenue sharing project, if it's a project in the 6-year program
Right.
that needs the funding to meet an advertisement date that's within a year, that request, a locality can make that transfer request. It requires full board approval, but the board can consider those requests if the funds are needed to meet an advertisement or award date that is within 12 months of the date of the request.
I get that.
Is the
Just-
recommendation.
I'm still, I get it. It's a policy matter for me. The good news is, when y'all vote on this, I won't be on the board, so.
Well, look, here's another, the issue from my perspective is we do not score revenue sharing projects. And therefore, when these monies transfer, and I'm for the revenue sharing project, don't get me wrong, I believe it's a part of it, but it's a part of an overall program. And that's where I try to make my comments that the intent of what our legislature wants is we want projects that are competitively scored and competed against because we have limited resources. This program is not that way. It's pretty much set up to fill in the voids. That's what it was meant to be. And I do believe, quite frankly, that there needs to be a program where there are simply just political projects. In other words, where the localities have a project that they simply, for political reasons that we don't know, they have to get done in that. but they're not scored. And that's the problem I have with the size of this program, and the fact that monies are being transferred around and are being gamed the system. Now, that's what they've done because they put them from one to another. Now, many of these things here I think is going to close a lot of that, and we'll see how it's actually being used. But at the very heart of it is, this is the way we used to do everything, pretty much, politically driven. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying it's not the core program under Smart Scale.
And, Mr. Chairman, I think the essence of the recommendations are to tighten those loopholes.
Yes, I agree.
And in this particular case, it is one involving CTB board membership. Two, it is tightening it up to make sure that transfers are to effect a project that is within 1 year of going to advertisement, or it comes back to the board for deliberation and decisioning. And that, I think, is an important distinction of, one, keeping in touch with the purpose. One of the purposes of revenue sharing was to be able to fund projects that can be done immediately and can be done, and also to include the local level in some of that decisioning, who have skin in the game. 50% of it is local money. And therefore, that's one of the reasons why we don't have some overall scoring, because what's important to one community may not fit the scoreboard for the entire state.
I get that. This thing really jumped up when there were no monies going to the localities through the formulas. I mean, the history. So that was the only game they had.
Now
and I don't necessarily mean politically in the bad term to say, oh, they're just doing it not because there were a lot of times projects were picked politically from the standpoint they were good projects. So I don't mean to give that. And at the local level particularly, there might be such a project. Maybe it wouldn't score all that great, but it's politically necessary. So I think a program like this, because they're elected officials, is. All I'm suggesting is, and I think, I don't know where others are, is let's make sure it's the tail's not wagging the dog in there, and that we are getting it back to that purpose, because it was much more, and the comments we heard over the last 6 months, it was a core part of their funding their programs.
And the other thing that has happened is Smart Scale.
That's
and
right.
only half of these projects in revenue sharing would have been in Smart Scale to begin with. So what about the other half? And that's the reason we're trying to put some caps so that those large projects that were playing both sides will now play Smart Scale and allow those other projects to be the tier 2, 3, and 4 to be part of the game. Now, but notice that anytime there is a project deallocated, Mr. Fralin, you're correct, that money comes right back. That doesn't go, and that's not played with anywhere else. It comes back into the pot for additional consideration. But it also is important to remember now we're going on a biennial process here. So by virtue of that, that has the capability of stretching out projects that suddenly become underfunded because of some reason at the time that it was first funded, unless you have this kind of leeway to be able to use a surplus fund within a locality to allow the other fund, still the obligation of the locality, to go forward in advertising within the next year.
Mr. Chairman, I get it. This, my balking is over this one little piece. So, somebody said don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, this committee's done great work. I mean, don't mistake that. I mean, this is really moving the ball down the field, so to speak. But it's just a philosophical philosophical thing that I have, that's all. And I understand it's a very limited situation.
I'll finish with the recommendations. An additional recommendation of the Study Committee is that any funds transferred from an existing active project cannot be backfilled with future revenue-sharing funds. And that is just to make it clear to a locality. If they make a choice to make a transfer from an existing project because they say there's another existing revenue-sharing project that's a higher priority, based on that choice, they also need to make a commitment that they're going to provide local funds and they will not come back and ask for revenue-sharing funds to backfill that. And because most of the transfers will have this limitation of expected to meet an advertisement or award date within 1 year of the request of the transfer, language has been added to both the policy and will be added to the guidelines that indicates that if a locality requests a transfer based on that commitment, the project is going to be advertised or awarded within 12 months, that if that does not occur, that the department will reserve the right to deallocate those transferred funds, working with the CTB member. And I'll go back to one other recommendation that I skipped.
Secretary?
Yes, I'm sorry, Scott, Mr. Casper.
Ms. Brown, can you tell us, it's hard to identify the benefits of some of the discussions going on without knowing how often this actually happens. In the context of our allocations of revenue sharing funds, how often do we end up with overages that need to be redistributed within that locality? Is it common? In the context of $100 million, would we have overages of $5 or $7 or $10 million? It's really hard to understand the benefit of this without understanding the magnitude of the issue.
Most of the time when there's funds remaining on a completed project, it's fairly small, under $100,000.
Right?
Under $100,000. There may be some occasions where it's a little bit more than that, but the majority of
So if they are small, and I guess not with they don't occur with regularity, might it not be best just to claw these funds back and simplify this process?
Well, I think that if you're talking about a completed contract, they're small. What the transfers were, a lot of them were, and it's probably more locality specific than it is program specific. There are several who figured out how they could transfer monies, lots of monies, to get a project and then to get another project, and they were using it sort of as a stake. A lot of what's happening here is going to fix that. I mean, if the board takes these recommendations. I think the actual where a project ends up and there's monies left over, that is, I think that's relatively, typically where I've been involved with it, where we've gotten the request, they need money for something else, can we find money? We'll have VDOT go in and look at the revenue and other programs and say, well, here's some money here. You can't, that, you can move. And a couple of those have been pretty high profile where we've done that in that. And so, but for political purposes, I mean, I do believe there needs to be some monies in the Commonwealth where politics help drive the decision over smart scale. I do, because there are some roads and stuff, things simply done because the citizens, elected officials, they want that project done and scoring. So it just shouldn't be the major part of our program, and I think that's what revenue sharing helps a lot in that regard. I think what we need to make sure it's not being gamed from the offset of taking it away from what the real intention is. And like I said, we're funding 50% of these projects, which is higher funding than any other, I think, program that we have, particularly when you the smart scale. And it comes off the top, remember. It comes right off the top. We're saying these projects, we're not going to score. We're just saying, it's you get to use this, and it's, purely based on the needs of the localities, and we're just trusting you that it's a good project.
And the transfers to projects that have not previously received revenue sharing, those are pretty rare because those currently all come before the board, but they've averaged 6 to 8 per year for the last 3 years.
Secretary, I think from our discussions, the big driver with this recommendation is, as Dixon explained, is having a project that's a viable project that has some level of shortfall that will be delayed for 2 years before we can fund it. And I think the delay piece of this was what was driving this recommendation. I understand the gaming and all that, but there is another
legitimate
level of
purposes,
oversight in this that didn't exist before. And that, to be honest with you, that's how we got to this place, is try to keep, we don't like to have money stale sitting somewhere for some long period of time, and this is our way of keeping the project moving. So I think that's where we were coming from when we were.
And I will point out, there's one more recommendation, and that is from a canceled project. Currently, there's been no restriction on transfers from a canceled project. The committee's recommendation will be that if a project's canceled, those funds would be deallocated and they would not be eligible for transfer to another project. I will point out that in their survey, we did ask localities questions about the different transfer options that were being considered. Most of those transfer options, as you would imagine, were opposed by localities. The primary recommendation, which is to make most transfers comply with the deallocation policy, which is to only allow those transfers when a project needs the funds to meet an advertisement award date within 1 year. Out of the different options, that one had the least opposition among localities, but still 45% supported it, 55% opposed it, but that was still less opposed than the other options that were being considered.
And therein is really the heart of what this is, and it gets back to the first question we had. The localities want these funds, and they want them 100% in their control. I mean, that's really what this is. They tend to view them more as entitlement once they get them versus putting on a project. That's really, I think, what we've seen across the Commonwealth. That most of them centered around because they don't get any monies anymore. By the formula goes to, it's all regional. We make them compete, which obviously we think is right. That's sort of our legislature. But that's really, I think, why we're seeing a lot of the pushback in that. But I do think we need to give them, if this is a recommendation, more time for them to come. They've obviously heard this conversation. I've already gotten text from people listening that pointing out the errors of my ways. So I'm sure we're going to hear some more. But I think that's I think the community's done a great job, and I think this will tighten up a great deal. Without hurting the program, maybe hurting some users of the program, the way they were using it, because they got limited resources too. They're trying to find any way they can.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, because I won't be here when y'all ultimately do this, I think I would just like to point out that unless they come up with something new, the comments they've already submitted are going to be what you're going to hear.
That's right. I agree.
And so it's going to be important for the board, if we believe this is the way to go, to stick to our guns here, because there's going to be pressure, and I suspect, and it's in the legislature's prerogative to change this if they want to, and they may be pressured to do that. So but we have to do what we have to do for the best interest of the state, and that I don't know. It's probably superfluous, but
let me then recap where we go from here. The process has two things. One, a general concurrence around the table at our next meeting as to our policy. And then from that, we'll drive the guidelines, which are mandated by the state. It's an 11, 12-page document, which you will get. Currently, it is being revised by staff to accommodate the policy. So that's the reason why we need to when we leave here in a month, we need to have concurrence as to what we are agreeable to the policy, The guidelines will then be drafted to conform to the policy, and then in July, we then approve officially the policy and the guidelines.
And I would mention to those in the audience, those listening through live streaming, I think you can be safe to say it's going to be very similar to what this presentation is. It could be changes, but the point is, you know, over the next 60 days as you're looking, this is where we're headed. We haven't done that. We'll do that next month, but I think it's fair to them that it's going to be coming out of some of these recommendations.
Yes, sir.
So as they
And my
look at-
guess is, Mr. Chairman, that we will have in our recommendation, the recommendation to review these guidelines and policy over a two-cycle term. You're correct, we could do it next year, but at least that puts it in a stated recommendation that future board may be able to turn to and say, hey, it's time for us to look at this thing if we haven't already done so. But I remind you that the purpose here is, one, to tweak and improve the program that is highly endorsed, highly supported by rural and urban. Make no doubt about it, we've not received anything that says this is not a good program. And to prevent the opportunity for gaming this a little bit now with Smart Scale, because we were having and saw instances of multiple applications where, especially for very large projects, so by capping the total allocation, that will eliminate that, according to staff. We'll see when we review it again in two cycles whether that's true. But at the same time, it will allow communities, and especially the smaller communities, to be able to fund projects that are important to them that may not be smart scale projects, but are still very important to those communities to the extent that they're willing to put in a 50% match.
Okay, Ms. Hines?
I would just like to ask that Nick and some of the other folks think a little bit about how in this new construct revenue sharing works or doesn't work with Smart Scale. We had some conversation about this yesterday, and we ourselves were unclear about if you got revenue sharing money in 1 year, but your Smart Scale can you use it to leverage your project or not? And I think
Currently you can. Currently you're able to do so.
Well, I know, but there's a real time lag, and so I think having a little bit of thought to that so that we can give guidance to particularly smaller localities who may be looking at this as a source to pull down a project cost. I just think it would be helpful to have that before we make these changes.
That is the whole key, because I assume we're continuing to look at the total pot. Right now, although I know people want more, it's a significant pot of money compared to what we have in total to allocate. So I think we have to do that. Ms. Valentine?
Yes, Mr. Whitworth, is it clearly defined, or is this something we should consider existing revenue sharing project? If this recommendation stays and we are able to transfer it to an existing revenue sharing project, should we define that very clearly to make sure it is tier one, something that has been approved? Because I think Mr. Fralon's point, existing.
By definition, it will be tier one because it will already be a fully funded project that may be short.
You just put in there tier one.
Yeah,
Maybe.
At some point, we may be funding tier two, we might be funding other, no?
But once they're funded, they become tier one.
Becomes a tier one.
Okay,
Yeah, once
okay.
it's funded, yeah.
Questions? Thank you, Mr.
Okay, as expected, I thought that would be a robust conversation, and I suspect we'll have more, but I think the stakes are pretty high, and we do want to make sure that we're using the monies efficiently. So All right, now we have a non-combative or topic of smart scale and finalizing everything. So, Mr. Donahue, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning. What I'll be presenting on is really the culmination of the last 4 months of working with you all, the public and others as they've commented on the staff recommended funding scenario for smart scale. And as I mentioned last month, what you're going to have before you today is a resolution for you all to consider to whether adopt the changes you have individually identified to as really the consensus scenario for smart scale, so that staff will include that in the final 6-year program that will be before you for consideration next month. So just a quick reminder, the staff recommended scenario did not fully obligate all of the funds that were available. There were approximately $60 million or so in district grant program funds that were not allocated, and just under $6 million in the statewide discretionary high priority projects funds that were unallocated. The recommendations that I'm going to go through district by district do spend the bulk of the district grant program funds, or allocated, and allocate every single dollar of the remaining $5.775 million in high priority projects funds. So just in order, starting with the Bristol district, they had a little over $3 million in district grant program funds remaining. We are recommending that we unfund an existing project recommended for district grant and fund a modified version of it that was also scored very highly but cost a little bit more, and so it was lower down. We skipped over that because we had essentially funded a different version of it earlier. Mr. Stinson indicated that due to the trucks that used that facility, dealing with the turning radius was important for that area, so we are recommending funding that project with this additional component there. It's a few $100,000 more. We're also recommending that the Route 58 truck climbing lane phase 2, and again in round 1 you did phase 1 of this project, be advanced with the remaining $2.5 million or so of district grant program funds and approximately $2.8 million in high priority project funds. And that would spend every dollar of the district grant program funds in the Bristol district.
So just so the board knows, the district, and he's going through this, but the district members this is their recommendation. In other words, working with them in that regard.
All of these recommendations, thank you, Mr. Chairman, are things that have come from board members. None of these are staff changes. These are board-directed changes to the staff recommended scenario. As the chairman has said multiple times, we put out the scores and we will fund them in order, but you all still have discretion. You are the ones on the ground in these areas, and you understand some things that may be very obvious when you're in the field, but aren't as obvious when you're doing the scores in a conference room in Richmond. Moving on to the Culpeper district, that district had almost $6 million in funds available that were unallocated. They also had a project that received approximately $1.5 million in safety funds that had been recommended for funding, which gave them a little over $7 million in funding available. There were 2 projects that are recommended for funding. One is in Orange County, and it's addressing a speed and safety issue on Route 601. The second is an intersection improvement in Louisa County at Route 208 and 522. This is near Lake Anna there. These are 2 projects that are not eligible for high priority project funds, and I bring that up because had they been eligible, they did score high enough where they would have been funded in the staff recommended scenario using high priority funds, but they're just not eligible because they meet safety needs and not a need on a corridor, statewide significance, or a regional network. And that would leave about $500,000 in the Culpeper district that would roll over to round 3. In the Fredericksburg district, they had about $5.5 million that was available in their 3 projects that are recommended for funding with the remaining funds. One is a park and ride lot in Essex County. The second is an additional turn lane into the Naval Base Dahlgren. If you're calling round 1, we actually funded a different turn lane. This is a complementary turn lane into that facility. There's lots of people commuting into work there. Maryland's currently working on a project to improve the Nice Bridge, and so we do expect to see higher volumes along the 301 corridor in the future, and this turn lane will help facilitate access into that major employer, the naval base there. And the final one is an additional park and ride lot in King William County. Overall, those spend about $3.5 million, and there will be $2 million approximately that would roll over to round 3 in the Fredericksburg district. In Hampton Roads, they had a large amount of unallocated district grant program funds, almost $15 million. They also had a $1 million project that, after the recommended scenario was released, was funded regionally using the CMAQ funds, which are under the control of the TPO. There are 2 projects that are recommended for funding with some of these available district grant program funds. One is in Accomack County, and this is, I believe, a follow-on to a project that was funded in Route 1, so it's essentially phase 2 of that. And the second one is an intersection improvement in Surrey County there that I believe addresses some safety issues. They would still have about $5.5 million that would roll over into Round 3, remaining after these 2 allocations.
5.5 or 6.6?
I'm sorry, 6,
Yes,
my apologies.
That's all right.
The slide is correct. I misspoke.
That's all right. Where did Mr. Malvin, did he take off? Okay. That's just a lot of money left over. Just was interesting.
And I did mention that to Mr. Malvin recently, and I think at this point his intent is to let that roll over. In the Lynchburg district, they also had a large amount of unallocated district grant program funds, and they also had a project that was redesigned that resulted in savings of about $2.3 million, but still provides the safety benefits, and that was modifying a roundabout at Route 15 and 360. And the changes there are really just the number of lanes within that roundabout, and they were building a 2-lane roundabout, but traffic volumes today and well into the future don't really warrant or require a 2-lane roundabout, and so this provides all the safety benefits of the original project, but does so at a lower cost. That gives the district almost, a little over $15 million to allocate. There are 3 projects being recommended. One is an intersection in Halifax County for about $4 million. Another is the Route 22 project in Campbell County, and that's really a connector between 2 major primary routes, and so it will serve pretty significant traffic volumes going between 2 major roads in the area. And the final one is some intersection improvements in the town of Farmville, and Lynchburg will have a little under $1 million that would roll over to Round 3.
Just add one clarification. The Charlotte County savings was actually an error in the estimate. So the scope is exactly the same. It's just a lower cost. They were assuming the 4 lanes going to 2 lanes, but the scope was always intended to be 2 lanes.
In Northern Virginia, there's about $10 million that was unallocated, and our understanding is that the district folks would like to roll that over into Round 3, which will increase their district grant program funds available for the next round.
Unless that may be needed for bids that come in over. So.
And that is a very good point. Ms. Hines and Mr. Kaswitz and Mr. Garzinski did raise that they were particularly interested in having a cushion with a large number of projects that are going out there. Some do require right-of-way, and we are hopeful it won't be necessary, but there is I think a little more risk in Northern Virginia than in some other parts of the state due to the right-of-way cost that, things simply could come over, estimate.
Mr. Johnny, let's assume it's 6 months from now, and looks like things are coming in better, and Northern Virginia wants to allocate it to a project. Can it do so?
Mr. Chairman, board policy would need to be changed for them
Okay,
to
so
be
right
able to
now,
do so.
okay.
What they could not do, and the board could not do, even if it chose to change its policy, is the project to be funded would have had to have been submitted in either Round 1 or Round 2 of
Right,
Smart
that's what
Scale.
I mean, submitted project.
Because the
But
law
right
requires
now,
that it have been
okay.
evaluated.
Okay, fine.
Mr. Chairman, I would just also note that we have had to go very far, far down the list to find a project that this was a sufficient amount of money for. And so that was the other part of our consideration, was better just to let it sit and be a cushion and sort of see what plays out.
And I would note, Mr.
problem.
Chairman, that unlike the revenue sharing fund, which is money in the current fiscal year, the monies we're talking about right now are going to be in FY23. And so this isn't money that will be sitting around losing value. This will be on a project long before it ever becomes time to spend this money. In the Richmond district, there are a number of changes that are proposed. There was about $4 million that was unallocated. And we are also making an update to a Round 1 project, which was a park and ride lot in the city of Petersburg. It was awarded approximately $13.5 million. We have been working with the city discussing that project. The estimate for that is now closer to $8 million. That is a very significant change, and I do, as staff say, we have put in place some new procedures to make sure that we don't have such variance in the future. You know, that money maybe could have been better used in round one, and so we don't like to see these types of things happen. But I do want you all to know that we've put in place some internal things to try and make sure this doesn't happen in the future. That does free up, though, about $5.5 million. And then also, Mr. Brown wanted to reduce the 95-64 corridor lighting project by about $3.3 million. So it would take it down from 10.4 to about $7.2 million. There was also a project in Chesterfield County that was funded with revenue sharing that frees up approximately $1 million. There are two projects that are being recommended for funding. One is the Route 360 project in Hanover County. This is the final phase of a project that has been underway for a number of years in Hanover County. I believe they already have certain right-of-way and other designs in place, and there were lots of folks who showed up at the public hearing to speak towards this. And the second one would be funding a complementary phase of the Richmond Henrico Turnpike that was submitted. There were two phases Henrico County put in. The northern segment was recommended for funding. The southern segment was a few projects out of the funding scenario. It is being recommended for funding, and this would complete the full link there between 295 and a major road in the city of Richmond, and it also deals with some redevelopment that is projected to happen at Richmond International Raceway. And that would spend every dollar there, and it does require $1 million in high priority project funds. And the counties, I should note, are also each putting up approximately $780,000 of their own money in addition to whatever they've previously put on these projects, which is not insignificant, particularly in the case of Henrico County. Moving on to Salem, and I'm going to talk about Salem in two batches because I think it will be easier to follow there. They had about $2.6 million that was available. The first kind of set of changes is there two projects were funded in I-81 in this area. One was to add a northbound auxiliary lane between exit 140 and 141, and the second was to add a southbound auxiliary lane between those same mile markers. The board may recall that in round one, you funded an auxiliary lane northbound on I-81 between exits 141 and 143. We are recommending to take the funding from the projects that are recommended and build a complementary project so that between 141 and 143 you have a uniform section of interstate there, and so you would build an auxiliary lane that would go along with what was funded in round one. That project did score very well and was just a few spots away from being recommended this round, and those are essentially a one-for-one transfer. It does require about $1 million in the district grant program funds that was unallocated. The second tranche of changes here is unfunding three projects that were recommended, or two projects, excuse me, that were recommended for funding, and one project that was funded through the open container funds, and funding additional safety improvements southbound on I-81 at the S-curves in the town of Buchanan. It's approximately about $6 million that's available for that purpose. If you recall, we've actually talked about the S-curves on I-81 there. We did a substantial amount of improvements northbound. We did some improvements southbound, but we didn't have the same amount of changes there. And so this project would allow the district to go back in and make some additional improvements southbound. So hopefully that will see some of the same benefits safety-wise that we saw northbound. And again, northbound is very significant. We saw an 80% reduction in the crash rate in that area. And so we're very hopeful that these southbound improvements will provide a similar benefit. In the final district, Stanton, they had about $7 million that was originally unallocated. They did have one project that was a little over $500,000 that was funded through safety, giving them about $7.6 million in funds available. There are four projects that are recommended for funding. One is an intersection improvement in the town of Luray for just over $1 million. The next is an intersection in Frederick County at Route 277 and Warrior Drive. The third is a project in Augusta County, adding a new roundabout for $1.5 million. And the final is an improvement to the exit 247 interchange on I-81 for about $2 million there, or it's not $2 million, I'm sorry, that's about an $8 million project with the remaining $2.3 million in high priority project funds. That would spend all the remaining money available within that district, and that final allocation, along with the other two allocations of high priority project funds, would spend every dollar in the remaining statewide discretionary funds. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions the board may have.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Donahue? Just to remind the board, you'll pass the resolution in our our action item agenda today, and then that would be another 30 days for the public to weigh in again, and then your final vote will be in June for the adoption of these to be in the plan. This will be the culmination of almost a 6-month process, because these have been out there since January the 15th of this year. So full vetting out there for public comment, and I think, based on that, we've achieved a result that is as efficient as we can. And so that will be the process moving forward. Okay, then we'll take that up. And Mr. Donahue, I think it's the first time you've been up with no questions, so.
It was very short.
That's right, so. All right, then, moving on, next up, I think, is the commissioners' items, and we'll go through the staff reports, and then we'll move into our action item.
All right, 2 quick items. First of all, if you recall last year, we reported that we advertised $2.6 billion in calendar year 16. And I just got an update from our Deputy Chief Engineer, Mr. Mashahi, and he tells me that we have a current advertisement to date is $868 million. So again, very strong early part of the year. We tend to, the largest amount of, for a single month tends to be towards the end when paving schedules go out. So again, a lot of work going out on the streets again this year. The other item I have to bring to the board, I have a project in Northern Virginia, the Route 7 corridor improvements, and this is a project valued at over $100 million, and as part of our risk reporting, I bring these to the board to bring to your attention the work that's been going on this project. This project, estimated the budget of this project is $233.9 million. It was funded in Smart Scale Round 1, a portion of it. There's significant local funding on this project, being Fairfax County. I don't know the funding sources, but again, significant funding coming out of that county on this project. This is also one of the largest, if not the largest, non-limited access design-build projects that we have in Virginia. This is fundamentally an urban widening project. State Route 7 is critical to northern Fairfax County, the Reston area, as well as Loudoun County. It is really the way to get to Washington from Leesburg if you don't want to use the Dulles Greenway. Again, this project, some challenges in getting the project within budget, and I want to commend the district staff working with the localities and utility providers and others. They've been able to do a number of things to, without reducing the benefit of the project, but adjusting scope and working with Fairfax County regarding some of the contingency to keep it within budget. Again, as a smart scale project, if they can't remain within budget, they would have to come back to this board if it was going to exceed thresholds. But again, really good work there. A lot of complications on this project. It has been one that's been in the work for a number of years, and you'll see in the risk briefing, fundamentally it's very utility rich, and because it has been, that road has existed since colonial times, and so utilities and everybody has enjoyed the use of that right-of-way over the last couple of hundred years. It includes a major gas pipeline, natural gas pipeline that we're working with. But some of the things that, again, working on utility coordination, and that work is ongoing, as well as noise walls throughout the segment. In addition to that, some geotechnical challenges, but not, I would say, significant. And also in the area of Colvin Run, which is a historic site and also a creek, there are wetland impacts that our team is working with the Corps of Engineers, figuring out how to reduce the footprint, and our team is having ongoing discussions with the Army Corps of Engineers. Again, overall, the project does not have significant wetland challenges, but this one particular stream crossing it does, and we're trying to balance some of the needs in terms of both vehicle travel, but also there are equestrian trails associated with this project, as well as bike and pedestrian facilities. So I'm confident that our team, as they continue to work through this process with the Corps of Engineers, we will get to a permittable situation there. The project is expected to go forward towards advertisement, and again, I'm confident and comfortable with the work to date of the project team as they continue to monitor these risks. And I think this process and this exercise for the VDOT team continues to reinforce the importance of not just checking the box, but identifying these risks and capturing them both in terms of procurement, but more so resolving them as we work through the process and not just kicking them down the road literally to some later date. So again, very comfortable with this project moving forward, and we'll be taking it to advertisement shortly. And that's all that I have.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Kilpatrick? Okay, Ms. Mitchell.
Or just a few short updates. First of all, the work of our Revenue Advisory Board is continuing, and this is the group, again, that's being led by Mr. Williams. We are having our two final meetings coming up in the next several weeks on May 26th, and then our final meeting will be on June 16th. We do expect that we will bring some preliminary recommendations back to you at the June meeting for your review, and with a reminder that we would then know our report to the General Assembly. I believe it's on August 1st. So that would be your opportunity to review that and give us any comments or insights on that. Just to know, many of you were familiar with the Metro Safety Commission legislation that we were pushing very hard for and that was approved by the Virginia General Assembly this past session. I just wanted to report that yesterday we received news that the Senate, U.S. Senate ratified that legislation, so it still needs to pass in the House, but for us it's a very, very important step to getting the MSC established and mobilized. So we're excited about that. Our review of Metro with Ray LaHood is ongoing. I know at our last meeting in Charlottesville, we had John Picari, who's a part of that team, come and meet with you all about it. He's still in the information gathering phase. Our analytical work and data collection is continuing as well, but I do expect that we'll be bringing back some preliminary information to you in the next several meetings. On the rail side, I believe I mentioned yesterday that many of you are very familiar with the Ashland situation that came up during our DC to RVA work, and we are beginning the process of this community advisory committee, and the first meeting is actually going to be Monday in Ashland. I believe the group has 13 members that have been nominated by the town of Ashland, Hanover County, and also Randolph-Macon University and CSX. So we will begin that process while we continue to look at other alternatives there as well. The draft EIS for DC to RVA is moving forward. We hope to be able to publish it in late June. We're getting comments from FRA finally, but they're coming in a lot more slowly than we would like. So we're pushing very hard to try to get it done by the end of June, but it really will depend also on FRA's ability to get comments back to us on a timely matter. So that would kick off then a public hearing process or a public notification process of 60 days, which would allow public comment and then also some public hearings as well. So that's all the updates I have for right now.
Yes, Mr. Rosen?
Ask Ms. Mitchell real quickly. The legislation on the Safety Commission is going to the House, so would we expect that the 5% holdback in transit money to the state would be released in the next couple of months? Or?
Oh.
No, that unfortunately, the holdback is tied to the certification of the Metro Safety Commission, which means that's when we're fully mobilized. And there's a certification process we have to go through with FTA. So while this is a very important milestone, it also gives us the ability to keep moving forward with mobilization. It's not the step that triggers the holdback or release of the funds.
Okay, any other questions from Ms. Mitchell? Okay, just a couple things. Just want to point out, I was in front of the Senate yesterday, and Metro Safety Commission got passed, just saying. It was, you know, and that, so, but.
A coincidence.
No, that is a momentous thing for us, and I was going to bring that up, Ms. Rosen. Thank you. Once it goes to the House, that's a milestone we need to get to. But the Trump administration has said they want an operational stood-up MSC, which will be difficult to get done before the end of the year. We're pushing as hard as we can. We are working with our partners in Maryland and D.C., but that's going to be difficult to do. I'm not sure if it's part of an overall strategy. As you know, the president's budget significantly reduced the budget of transportation. I don't know if this was a consideration in that, but right now the only goalpost we have, and it's changed, is the MSC needs to be operational in that. So wanted to mention a couple things about technology. First of all, VDOT won an award, an Innovation and Development Award for their Smart Portal, where not just for smart scale, but for revenue sharing and all that. So wanted to recognize those efforts, which leads me to a little larger conversation about technology. I know the committee's been meeting. We've had a lot of reports related to Virginia and elsewhere about this. The issue is whether or not technology is going to drive changes, or whether or not we're going to adopt technology to help us with our plan. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So in Virginia, we have taken a very deliberative approach to using technology where it makes sense in saving monies, but also not forcing technology into places where may stymie it, because it is still developing. Autonomous vehicles and drones are the most obvious of this new technology. So what I would ask the subcommittee, and I think the way to look at this is, take a look at areas where we know technology can solve a problem. I mean, the one that comes to mind with autonomous vehicles is certainly this disabled community. If you wanted to take a snapshot and say, is that going to help the disabled community? I would think yes. The reason I say this is right now we don't know where technology is going. On the other hand, we don't want to make sure we stymie it, as I said before. So I think it would be prudent upon us to start looking at, and we've talked to VDOT, I know Rob Carey's looking at this, where technology can solve a problem. Not doing something because you can with the technology, but where it can solve a problem. And I think that will help focus us, because I know I've had conversations that have happened, where is this going? And the fact of the matter is, I'm not quite sure. We just need to make sure that we are keeping all the doors open. But I think that would be a prudent way to move forward, is where are problems and where can technology solve those problems? And they could be aspirational. I mean, for instance, autonomous vehicles could solve it, but it's not here now. But there might be others where it's not so aspirational. There's certainly things we can do right now. And I know VDOT's doing a lot of that, traffic signaling, monitor, that type of stuff. So that's what I would point out to the technology committee. I would like to have we're going to have you guys come in and do a report, let us know where you are. But I think as part of that, that might be identify some areas so we can focus this conversation. Sort of what we listened to John Martin yesterday, gave great information, but how do we action it? I mean, part of it has been this fact that we need to understand what's going on, but I think we pretty much do. Now, how do we action it? And I don't want to, we want those actions to be as productive as possible. So I think that might be a good way to help focus this conversation on technology and moving forward. And that's also at the state level also. It's not nice to get a lot of, you get a lot of publicity and all that. And that does serve a purpose because it makes awareness. But I don't think that's really what's going to drive technology in our programs. It's going to be solving certain issues. So I'd ask if you would look at that and then talk with the committee and then have in the next couple of months a report, just not on that, but your other activities. So it's sort of tying in with this whole issue of the retreat we're going to do and just how we're going to pull all these things together to make it, elevate your decision-making. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish. So in that, I'll also congratulate the board. I mean, this will be the second year now of funding Smart Scale with this new process. And while we do have some questions and some issues to deal with, I think, again, another very, very successful round of how we're allocating it. We were recognized yesterday, quite frankly, for those efforts in prioritizing outcome-based solutions and using our monies efficiently. So that's part of, I think, what we're going to see at the national level. At least my advice would be in allocating resources to look a little bit of what we've done here. With that, we are gonna take about a 15-minute break, and the reason, and we'll start the action items at 11. The reason is twofold. We need to check out of your hotel if you haven't. So those will give you a few minutes to go do that and settle up your bill. For those that are going on the plane, the vehicle is here. If we want to load your stuff on the bus, that'll be available. And then also, quite frankly, you can take a break. So why don't we simply, we're going to start 11 o'clock on that. First of all, let me thank Mr. Phelan and Mr. Rosen last night. A nice dinner. Very nice, good, Mr. Rosen
gets all the credit.
And that it was nice hospitality. It was great evening last night. And is there any other items come before the board during the workshop? Our next meeting, by the way, will be in Richmond.
Yes.
Because we'll be voting, so it'll be in Richmond, and we'll encourage Mr. Williams, if he's listening to this, to work with another place to eat. Not that we didn't like to go, but I think 4 times in a row we may want to set a record on that. So
maybe Mr. Brown can help.
Mr. Brown can help on that. That's right. So, all right. So with that, we're going to close the workshop session, and we will convene at 11 o'clock the action item agenda. Members to please take their seats. Let's see, I think we got Mr. Yates, I think we got everybody here. Okay, so I call to order the action agenda for the Commonwealth Transportation Board for the month of May 2017. Our first order of business will be public comment. Those who want to speak will be allowed to. Please, your oral comments are limited to 3 minutes. I'd ask you, please. And if you want to hand out anything, which I've already received one, I'll make sure it gets into the record and pass it around. Did we have anyone sign up? Okay, I know there's a gentleman in the audience who would like to speak to public comment. Would you please come up, sir, and just state your name for the record?
Otto Minjot from Blacksburg.
Okay,
I'd
good
like
morning.
to thank. I'm sorry. Good morning. I'd like to thank you for providing me with an opportunity to present to you a citizen petition that is so far signed by 469 individuals who have experienced the North Main Street, U.S. Route 460 bypass intersection. Citizens are asking, 1, for VDOT to withdraw the RCOT plan, 2, to encourage CTB to fund construction of a grade separated interchange, and 3, to ask the town of Blacksburg and VDOT to take all necessary measures to increase safety at that intersection. The town installed new signage and rumble strips on the North Main Street leading to that area. Also, VDOT, with the help of our district's representatives, Mr. Fralin and Mr. Rosen, came up with an excellent alternative to the RCOT plan, the displaced left concept. Here, I'd like to thank our representatives and the VDOT engineers for their support and great efforts. The DLC cost the same amount of money as the RCOT plan, while it produced the same level of safety. The drawback was that it caused some hardship for our friends on Farmingdale Lane. It should be noted, however, that the DLC benefited a much larger segment of our population, and for the very same reason was favored by the vast majority of the local residents. Unfortunately, while no public hearing was held, the town council, by depending on defective information and reasoning, voted in a split decision to request CTB to consider the RCOT plan. The main problem with the RCOT plan is that it shifts the problem elsewhere in our town, namely the upper end of the North Main Street, Givens Lane, Patrick Henry Drive, and Toms Creek Road, where we have already seen 2 young students lose their lives. With the university expansion plan and the resulting drastic increase in the number of students and the town growth, the problem is only going to get worse. Furthermore, it is not right for a major town like Blacksburg, with a major state university, to partially close one of its major arteries. It should be noted that the RCOT plan is not favored either by our state representatives, Senator Edwards and Delegate Yost, or by our county board of supervisors. Many of us, including the town council, still hope that the CTB considers the demand of all the people affected to drop the RCOT plan and provide funding for a grade separate interchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for being here this morning. Thank you. Are there any other members or of the public or anyone who would like to make a comment to the Commonwealth Transportation Board this morning? Okay, we'll make sure that you get a copy, everybody gets a copy of the petition for this, but seeing no other persons wanting to speak, then that will conclude public comment. We'll begin the action items on the agenda. First up is the approval of the minutes from our April 19, 2017 meeting. Is there a motion for approval? Is there a second? Any comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, minutes are adopted. First up, looks like it's going to be not our chief engineer, but our commissioner here, Mr. Kilpatrick, for the maintenance division, or do you have somebody else doing that?
No, sir, and with your permission, I'll just do it here from
Yes.
my seat. This was delegated up to me by the chief engineer. He, his daughter is being married this Friday, and he's got a little bit of event planning still to work out. So I'm glad to do this today. This is a bridge naming, Carsville Community Memorial Bridge. It's in the Hampton Roads District in Isle of Wight County, and Carsville is an unincorporated town in that county. We have a resolution of support from the Isle of Wight Board of Supervisors, and I recommend your approval.
Mr. Malvin? All right. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion or comment? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that passes. Ms. Pryor, I saw you down there working out this morning, so you're all ready to go, I know.
I'm ready. I have two items for you this morning. The first item is the amendment of a project to the 6-year improvement program. It's a project in the city of Suffolk. It's a rail grade crossing, and I recommend your approval.
Malvin?
Recommend approval.
Any comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right.
The second item is my normal monthly transfers of surplus funds to ongoing projects, and I recommend your approval.
Motion.
Move to approve.
Second. Any comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, Ms. Pryor, thank you very much. Mr. Kilpatrick, it looks like you're up again.
I am, and this next item is authorization for me to execute an agreement with the United States Department of Defense regarding work we are doing on the Pentagon Reservation in Arlington County. This is part of the Atlantic Gateway and the 395 Express Lane Extension Project. The board is the entity authorized to enter into agreements with the United States government. So again, I'm seeking your approval to execute this agreement.
Ms. Hines,
Approval.
is there a second? Bless you, by the way. All those in favor, excuse me, any more comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. Mr. Kilpatrick.
All right, the next item I have is a temporary limited access break for Telegraph Road and Fairfax County Parkway in the Northern Virginia District, Fairfax County. This is to help facilitate the construction of the Backwick Road Bridge over the CSX tracks. This is another project associated with the Atlantic Gateway, and I request your approval.
Ms. Hines?
Move approval.
There's a second. Mr. Hunt. Any comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Ms. Brown, I know you're here. Good to see you again. It is.
Morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I have 3 items for your consideration. The first item is a request for economic development access funds to serve Deschutes Brewery in Roanoke. This is in Salem District. This access project will provide a 50-foot wide, 3,400-foot roadway with curb and gutter from the current end of Blue Hills Drive to serve the proposed 330,000 square foot brewery for production and distribution. The Virginia Economic Development Partnership has provided its support of the project and has determined that Deschutes Brewery is a qualifying operation under the Economic Development Access Program. Deschutes Brewery is anticipated to invest about $85 million and create 108 jobs. The Local Assistance Division recommends approval of the request for the maximum economic development access allocation of $650,000, $500,000 unmatched, and $150,000 matched. We would recommend your approval of this request.
Move. Mr. Freeland. Second. Any comments or discussion?
Make a brief.
Before we vote, we're going to do that, but I know, yes, you may.
Just want to thank Ms. Brown for this. This is, as many can imagine, out here in Southwest Virginia, this is a big deal to have an Oregon national top 10 brewery locate in the city of Roanoke. Brandon Turner from Economic Development's here, and Wayne Bowers, who is the head of City Economic Development, just went to hotel you all saw last night on top of the Market Garage that just opened. So just thank everyone for their work. This is really a big deal for the city.
All right, Mr. Tong? Okay, so
Nobody can vote.
there are no more, any comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ms. Brown?
Action item.
Hold on for a second here. I want you to understand that we kid you a lot, but we very much appreciate all you do.
Thank you.
No, very much so. And sometimes we get a little bit animated in our discussions, but it's not anything other than us expressing. So I want to publicly let you know we very much appreciate what you do.
Thank you very much.
In that sense. Okay.
Item number 7 is a revenue sharing transfer request.
Oh, boy. All right, Ms. Brown, maybe I spoke too soon now.
This is in the city of Roanoke.
There it is.
District.
Hey, is this tier 1? I mean,
Opposed to it.
The Dunker project is an existing revenue sharing project that is part of the Roanoke River Greenway. It runs from the Salem city limits to Ariel Way. This project has been completed and has a surplus of funds. The receiving project is also part of the Roanoke River Greenway and is currently in our 6-year plan and is funded with the Transportation Alternative Program funding. It runs from Ariel Way to Roanoke Avenue Southwest and basically is an extension of the current project. The receiving project has been advertised. However, bids have come in higher than anticipated, and the city needs additional funds in order to award the project. They have requested that we transfer the surplus funds from the completed project to the new project so that project can be advertised and move forward. And we recommend your concurrence in their request.
Mr. Chairman, if I...
Can't hate to hear this, Mr. Fralin.
Well, in my defense, this is exactly what I've advocated for. We have to approve this transfer. And that's all, and we're allocating the money. Everybody calm down. I will so move.
And the second, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, any other comments?
How much is the transfer?
Ms. Brown, how much is the transfer?
It is roughly $800,000, or $731,000, and it's from allocations in 2012 and 13 and allocations in 2013-14.
That's a good question.
May, yes.
So the transfer is going not to a revenue sharing project, it's going to a TAP project.
Correct. So essentially, Roanoke River Greenway, they had one project was funded with revenue sharing, and they had an adjoining property that was funded through transportation alternatives. And so they're requesting to transfer it to the transportation alternative project that has a shortfall.
Just raised that issue that as we look at the policy, we're limiting the transfer to only the Tier 1 revenue sharing project. So this would change going forward.
It would simply that any request that's to a non-existing revenue sharing would come to the full board for discussion and consideration.
Which is our
All
current
it's
policy.
saying is if you want to do this, you have to come to the full board and get approval, just like we're doing today.
Our current policy doesn't disapprove it. I mean, doesn't
Okay,
disallow.
well, maybe this is.
This request,
A transportation alternative project considered a revenue sharing project?
is not, but it is in the 6-year.
I raised that issue, right?
But that just, all that means is we have to approve it.
New policy says you still have
Under
to.
the existing policy, they can transfer internally, but until we fix it, which we're working on fixing it, you can move money around internally. If you want to move money outside of the revenue sharing program,
just comes to the
then you
board.
have to have the board approval, and we're saying that you have to do that. You'll still have to do that in the future. I think I got that right.
That's right. That's correct, yeah. Any other comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. Okay, Ms. Brown?
Okay, the last item, action item number 8, is for requests for authority for the commissioner to enter into agreement. It's very similar to one that our commissioner we just went over briefly. But a project agreement must be executed between Federal Highway Administration, Eastern Federal Lands, and VDOT to move forward with the obligation of federal funds for a project that received funding under the Federal Lands Access Program, also referred to as the FLAP program. Since it is an agreement with a federal agency, those agreements must have the concurrence of the board. There's a project also on the Roanoke River Greenway that the locality submitted an application and has received funding for a 1.7-mile extension of the Roanoke River Greenway. The resolution before you is to delegate authority to the commissioner to execute the agreement so that the funds can be obligated and the project can move forward. So we recommend your approval of this resolution.
Mr. Chairman, I do want to say one thing about this. This is a very interesting situation. The grant that was originally turned down, and Congressman Goodlatte and his office were very helpful. The actual superintendent of the Parkway came, and there's a issue about where the Roanoke River Greenway is going to cross the Parkway, which is obviously a federal park. And so we've been able to get that straight. What this will do is allow the access to the Parkway, to federal lands. And we kept trying, and ultimately another project fell through, and so we got the grant here. So this is really kind of a cool story, and forging ahead and perseverance. Thank you. So I just, for whatever that's worth, this is a cool project.
Is that a motion?
I move to approve it.
Is there a second? Second, okay. Any other comments or discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, Julie, thanks very much. All right, we have one order of new business, Mr. Donahue's resolution. Let me again refer to, this is not your actual vote to allocate the monies. This is a vote, a resolution to give the VDOT the directive to plan these, get it out there in the 6-year plan so that it's all ready for you to vote on next time in that. But we're telling the public that we're signaling the public that this is what we're going to be voting on, although there are still subject to changes in that. Mr. Donahue.
Chairman, I believe you said most of it. You all have a resolution before you. Should you vote in the affirmative, the final 6-year improvement program you'll consider in June will include these modifications you've requested. Should you decline to approve this resolution, then the draft 6-year program, as is before you now with regard to smart scale, will remain the same in the final that comes before you in June, and the staff would recommend approval based on the changes you've recommended through the public input process.
Have you all had a chance to read the resolution? Okay, if you have, I would entertain a motion.
So move.
Is there a second? Second. Mr. Casper, okay, second. Any comments or discussion?
Chairman, I'd like to point out in the Salem district, there's one project. It's number 1496. It's a Franklin County project that involves access to 220, which is we've just went through yesterday, our preserving our corridor. So there's a little more work that needs to be done on it. I'm going to vote for the resolution, but I just want to make it clear that needs to get fixed before the allocation. I'm going to recommend the allocation gets made. So, thank you.
Absolutely fine on that. I'll make one comment, Mr. Malvin. You had to go out and take a call, but when we went through the allocations, noticed there is a fairly substantial amount of money in Northern Virginia and in Hampton Roads unallocated. Perfectly fine. I know there's lots of activity down there. Big project could come in over budget. We need to move it around. Just pointing out that those. I think every other district pretty much used most of theirs, and that's fine. I just pointing that out so the public understands why we're doing that.
I can say that when we were looking at the other projects that could have been funded with that money, they were scored very low, and we thought that we would preserve that for the potential over budget or overestimate projects, and also roll it up in the next cycle where we could combine it with the other funding for more meaningful projects. So that's the rationale.
Name Ms. Hines and Mr. Casper had said, alluded to, so just making that clear. Any other comments or discussion on this resolution? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, I think, Kim, we got our marching orders now. We can put, Mr. Law, we can put the program together, and subject to no changes, the public knows what we're voting on in 30 days. There are no bids for us to have to approve this time. Is there any other business to come before this board?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to give you an update on the Innovation and Technology Subcommittee, and I welcome other members to chime in. But we are, to your point this morning, we are heading in that direction with a couple of things. The data portal, which will be opened up on June 30th, is our estimation from Morale and Dean. working on a truckers parking app, which will inventory and use technology to make available spaces for truckers, which are now backing up on the interstates. And so we should be hearing more about that in the next couple of months. And we're also helping Rob Carey come up with a framework of principles that will maybe, or maybe not, present some policy considerations to the board later on this year. And we hope to have an offsite or a longer meeting where we can discuss all these things before we present to the board. So just want to let you know we're heading in that direction.
Oh, great, good update on that.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Woodworth.
The chief engineer's not here, but I just wanted to make comment on the presentation yesterday on the arterial preservations, and I believe maybe Mr. Tung raised a question about why a particular route was not there. And looking over the map last night, I have several questions as to why certain routes are not there, and I assume we will have a more detailed discussion on that, as well as a definition as what actually is the defined language for an arterial route.
Yes, that pretty much falls with the VDOT's discretion, or not discretion, their recommendation, and make that determination. But certainly can encourage those talks. Mr. Patrick, any comments on that? Or?
We've talked in terms of, so the corridors of statewide significance were established by the Commonwealth Transportation Board some years ago, and there have been some updates and amendments to that. You will be, Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment will be working with you regarding the updates to VTrans, and the suggestion is that the designations of these I don't want to say corridors, because the corridors of statewide significance are not simply a route. It's not, you see the line for I-81, it doesn't mean just 81, it means the parallel routes and the feeders and so on. But what we're talking about here are specific route numbers and segments. So the thought is that as part of the VTrans, the board would consider what routes should be included in what we would call this increased attention to access management. So I think that there are some, Garrett wanted to get the map out there as a framework, give the board members opportunities to look at it and say, well, what about this area? Or maybe lengthening, shortening, different routes and so on. And then working through the VTrans process, which we think maybe is the vehicle that the board would, as a matter of policy, would say these are the corridors that we would designate for this higher level of oversight. So again, in terms of if there's a route that you're looking to add, I'll relay this to Garrett and reach out to, or if you can reach out to him directly, or and vice versa, to look at those routes as we move forward with the VTrans effort.
I had one request. So they gave me this really cool map.
Yep.
Which is the map, the official map, and they got it all worked up for me.
Right.
And everything, and my name's on it and all. And I'm going to put it on this table, and if anybody in this room that has anything to do with VDOT would sign it, I'd appreciate it, so I can put it up as a memento in the future. So I'm going to put it on the table.
We might want to take and get a few more signatures for you, too.
We don't need messages, we just need signatures.
No gesturing, no emoticons. That's right. No, that'd be great, but we'll do that. Any other comments? So there will be lunch immediately after here. I would think for those on the plane, we'll probably try to leave in about a half hour to 45 minutes to head out there. So give us a little bit of time to eat lunch, and then we'll head out. Anything else? All right, with that, we will adjourn the action item, and we'll see you next week in Richmond. Next month in Richmond.